Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
I know when we were talking a lot about the threat of nuclear holocaust, seems like one of the great problems is that it becomes unthinkable, that the mind can't wrap itself around that at all, that it's just simply too big in a way to even get hold of. And so, while that is the heaviest of all topics, I suppose, and the greatest kind of problem for any kind of Christian understanding of life, I think it is essential that we begin to look at it.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Sister Pat Schnapp, an associate pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the quest for meaning in the face of monstrous evil. Here's Father Bacik.
Pat, recently we have been doing some discussion and taking part in larger activities concerning some of the great and monstrous evils of our own time. And so we have gone through Ground Zero week when we've been thinking more about the dangers of the use of nuclear weapons and trying to alert people to the problems involved in the armament race. And we also spent some time remembering the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and remembering the 6 million who were killed in the concentration camps. And all of that is really a very heavy kind of topic. It sort of epitomizes the problem of evil and puts human suffering into the worst possible kind of perspective, I guess. I often think that those things are the great tragedies of our time. I suppose we can add to those all of the political imprisonments that go on in our world and the kind of torture that we find of other human beings. We think of the Gulag and in Russia and the wars around our world and the political prisoners in Central and South America. And so in so many ways this is what we would call monstrous evil. The mind hardly can get hold of this in any way. I know when we were talking a lot about the threat of nuclear holocaust, seems like one of the great problems is that it becomes unthinkable, that the mind can't wrap itself around that at all, that it's just simply too big in a way to even get hold of. And so, while that is the heaviest of all topics, I suppose, and the greatest kind of problem for any kind of Christian understanding of life, I think it is essential that we begin to look at it. I know that when we were preaching on the topic of Ground Zero week and the need to be more educated on matters of nuclear warfare and so on, that one of the great resistances that we encountered was the idea that, well, you can't think about this. It's too bad. It's too much of a downer. It will depress my spirits too much to begin to look at it. And yet it seems necessary to do that if we're going to in any way try to counter the threats that go on. I think back to the memorial for the 6 million who died in the Holocaust. One of the major ideas of that is to remember that event so that it can't happen again. The Simon Wiesenthal Center out on the West Coast often brings that out, that they can't let the memory of the Holocaust die, that we have to transmit this to next generations, that other people have to know about this monstrous evil that occurred, that the potential for human suffering that's built into our situation, that people can act in this kind of terrible and barbarous way. So that perhaps, again, the idea is we have to look at it, that we have to, as difficult as that might be. Do you want to respond to any way in that? You were part of some of that. I mean, just at the level of saying, you know, I know that you were there for the remembrance of the 6 million and have been very active in the whole nuclear question and so on. And I know that that is in some way a personal struggle for you to face up to those evils and to try to bring them to people's attention. And yet I see you doing that. And you want to comment at all on that, or if you can?
I guess only insofar as to say that without some sort of faith perspective, it would be very difficult, I think, for me to enter into any sort of activity relating to these tragedies and not simply go mad. I guess I can understand as I get immersed in issues and study on the strong possibility of some sort of nuclear holocaust which could lead to the extinction of the species. I can understand the prevalence of neurosis and psychosis in our society and the sort of cries of despair that we hear from so many of our artists and writers in various ways, and the sense that many have who do not have a faith perspective, that there's a certain rampant absurdity, a certain madness that seems to have taken over our consciousness and our world.
You know, as you're saying that, I'm reminded of the fact that many people are feeling this. There's a poll that I saw not long ago that I think said that something like almost 60% of the young people of college age felt that there would be indeed a nuclear war and that they were likely to die in it. So that somehow this is lurking in people's consciousness. We were having a discussion of this a couple nights ago, and one woman was describing a dream that she had. And she said that she really wasn't thinking about this nuclear problem at all, and she described the dream, and after Ground Zero week she became aware that the dream was all about her fears and had to do with the fact that she was under a nuclear attack at that time, and that all of these bad things that were happening and the civilization was being destroyed and so on was indeed part of her dream, or what triggered her dream, and she only knew that afterwards. And it got me thinking to whether maybe this threat of the bomb is not more at work in our world than we might think at first blush, and that maybe it's influencing people's psychic behavior and attitudes more than we might be aware of. But it's certainly, some people at least are saying, hey, we have to face up to that. We have to begin to deal with it. And as you said, I think very well, what the monstrous evil does is really raise the question of absurdity. Is life absurd or not, or does it have some sort of meaning? That's a question, of course, that's plagued us, I guess, especially in the 20th century. We think of the rise of existentialism, which was often very pessimistic on this. We think of Jean Paul Sartre and his notion that indeed human beings are useless passions, and his explicit statements that all of human existence is really absurd. We found a lot of that working its way out in the literature, I think, of the 20th century. As we begin to talk about that, I'm thinking about one of our favorite authors, Woody Allen, who's written a lot of plays and done movies and short stories, and somehow he always approaches it in a humorous way, but still underneath you sense the bite of it all. One time he was giving a speech to graduates, and he began the speech by saying something like this: well, I address you with a serious problem now. We really are at a crossroads in history. On the one side, we see the path that leads to total destruction. And on the other side, we see the path that leads to utter hopelessness and despair. And we must pray now that we choose wisely. Well, that bit of humor by Woody Allen there, the irony connected in with that statement, I think reveals in a way his deeper concerns with this problem of meaning and absurdity in life. I think I can recall him saying things that this is really the problem that concerns him. So even in this sort of humorous way, we see this undercurrent of the question of absurdity in the 20th century. I want to talk about Woody Allen. I hope that's not in some way not proper, since we're dealing with such a heavy topic, but perhaps it's good to bring in some of his approaches to it.
Well, I think Woody Allen is dealing very specifically with the problem of whether or not God exists, which is perhaps the heaviest concern of all, because if one decides God doesn't, somehow one is simply stuck with all of the evil of the world, and one has to try to make some sense out of what appears to be senseless slaughter, for instance, and the threat of total extinction. So Allen has a somewhat, I was going to say narrower concern, and yet I'm not sure it is a narrower concern, because it will help deal with all these other evils that you've been talking about. I think we can be misled with Allen because we can tend to think of him as a comic, and certainly he is, and yet there probably is a hardcore theological search afoot in Woody Allen that's probably not as deep or intense in a very large percent of the human population.
I guess when we're talking about Woody Allen, a lot of people know him through his movies, right? Annie Hall being one of the better known, Interiors, which I don't think so many people saw, but was really a striking film, and Manhattan, which was more popular again.
Right.
And short stories, too. What is the title of the one collection? Side Effects, isn't it?
Yeah, Side Effects. Right, right. Yeah. So we have here someone who is using the absurdity as a mode somehow for getting people to laugh, and yet there's a way in which his humor is black humor or dark humor or satiric humor, because what we're laughing at is, of course, a very, very heavy problem or heavy question. He'll say, for instance, something like, "Not only is there no God, but try getting a plumber on weekends." And there's a certain absurd non-correlation between those two items that causes us to laugh, and yet we can see that he's preoccupied with the whole God question. And he has said again and again that what he's looking for in life is answers, and answers specifically to this question of whether or not there is an ultimate meaning behind all that goes on in the world.
I was thinking the way people often experience this problem is maybe with what we call anxiety attacks. I know I was talking with someone recently who very graphically described this feeling of just a fleeting time when it would wash over them that, boy, it's all unraveling, that none of it makes any sense, that I'm falling into the pit, that that I might disappear from life, that I don't really control my existence at all, and just a terrible, sickening, lowering, despairing kind of feeling that would come over one. And I tried to assure the young woman that indeed this was not an uncommon experience that she was talking about. She had her own language for describing it, but I'm convinced that most people, one time or another in their lives, have that sense that it might all be unraveling, or I'm hanging by a thread and it could break, or where do I fit into the whole scheme of things, or is all this effort I'm putting into life really worthwhile in any sense? And so I think that this is the problem, as I would call it, anxiety. The German Angst is we translate anxiety, means a sort of fear which has no object, which you're not fear for a particular thing of heights or of talking in front of people or anything like that, but that the whole of life might be wrong, that everything might come tumbling down on one. And I think this is maybe where people often feel this question of the absurdity of life, and it raises, as you well said, I think, the religious question, the question of the existence of God. But maybe we should just stick sort of with that feeling for a while. It is the question, really, is there meaning or absurdity in life? I was thinking of another author with that, Saul Bellow, who was talking about the question. He says that all fiction writers in the 20th century had to make up their minds, get off the fence on that question. Do they come down the side of nihilism, that there's nothingness in life, or do they posit some sort of meaning? Do they think that there is a worthwhileness in it all?
And he doesn't exactly answer that question, but he does say that nihilism is an act of pride, and that in the face of this enormous question, it is presumptuous for any of us to come down on one side or the other. But what we must do is get in touch with our deepest impulses and our gut feelings, and to sort of run with them. But Bellow certainly does feel that we must, in some way, whether or not we acknowledge the presence of a God, that we must come down on the side of life, that the author cannot somehow counsel despair.
When you're talking about Saul Bellow, we probably ought to say just a few more words about what he wrote. One thing that I can remember he wrote was Herzog, a very novel that I really got into and I think raised this question in deep ways. He's got a new one out that's called December's Dean.
Dean's December.
Dean's
You were
December.
close. You were
Close.
very close.
What else?
Mr.
Humboldt's Gift.
Humboldt's Gift,
Yeah.
Mr. Samler's Planet, and many
And he's
short
received the
stories.
Nobel Prize.
And the
so-
Pulitzer Prize
yeah,
for Literature.
all that
yes.
kind of thing. Okay,
Mhm.
so back to Bellow then. What's he telling us then about this problem of meaning and absurdity?
Well, he certainly acknowledges the darkness in life, and he sees that as sort of a composite of the core terror that we have in facing death, and in our own personal guilt, the burden of the past that we carry with us, and also in the opposition of circumstances to our own aspirations. He often presents us with a hero who's caught in the middle of some sort of spiritual crisis, and he's somehow overcome by the forces in the world that seem to be opposing his own goals, and he's also scared by the fact of his own death. But at the same time, he suggests that we can rise to a certain dignity by somehow dealing with these fears, by transcending them, that somehow out of all the human possibilities, even in a dehumanized age, that human dignity can surface. And well, to quote him, he suggests that I like this line a lot, that we fumblers and bumblers, we cranks and cripples, we proud, sniffing, ragged-assed paupers of heart and soul, that we look again for the manhood we are born to inherit, that somehow we can salvage dignity from the wreckage of our lives, even if we have sinned or made gross mistakes, or even if we have somehow felt that life has been in opposition to us and that we have not accomplished what we have set out to do.
So Bellow does come down on the side of meaning, in other words.
Very much, yes.
And
yes.
suggests that in one way where we really encounter that problem and have to make a choice is in relationship to death of a loved one, and trying to really face our own deaths. Because that really sets the boundary, the ultimate boundary for our existence, and so often seems to show life to be absurd in many ways, especially when young people die, or where there's terrible suffering involved in death, or as we began with, when there is such massive deaths, the deaths of 6 million, a genocide attempt. Right? We think of Kampuchea and all that went on there. I guess when we encounter that kind of mass death, or I was just thinking of the Jonestown affair too, that somehow, boy, it seems so terrible that it becomes mind-boggling in a way. We can't get a hold of it. And yet I think Bellow is saying that for himself, that apart from, I think, very clear, explicit religious themes, that he does see this meaning in this, that it's possible to transcend even that kind of horrible suffering. And I think he links us in there very much then with our Judeo-Christian tradition. No, I think he brings us back to the idea that indeed we posit an ultimate meaning in life, that our key belief is that that death cannot have the final word, that the bonds of love are so strong among us humans that even death cannot destroy it. We're the ones who believe that God brings good finally out of evil, and that evil and human suffering is somehow redemptive. That is something that it seems to be distinctive in our Christian tradition, because we say our founder, Jesus Christ, suffered, and through his death and his obedience to the will of the Father, that he has been raised to life, and thus brought us the possibility of redemption and atonement and rising with him to a new and better life. So it seems as though our religious tradition begins to attack this problem very directly and forthrightly, and takes a strong position on that. In fact, it becomes the center point of the whole Christian faith, the paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of the Lord, that it's precisely through his death that we are saved. It's precisely because he emptied himself completely on the cross that God could fill him with the new and richer life, the glorified life, that through his death really he bursts through into a fuller context of meaning and of happiness, and went there to prepare a place for us. So we come at it very explicitly, and I would like to link that up with what Bellow was saying, I think, and his way of getting a glimmer of hope. I remember in reading Herzog, you had to read 400 pages or something before the moment of hope came. There's all this absurdity and this struggle, and Herzog's writing these letters to all these various people to clear his own mind, and he's trying to deal with this breakup of his marriage, and it really frustrates him and has really put him down into a feeling of despair, and he has to go seek help and so on. But finally he gets to the moment when somehow it makes sense to him. He rids himself of this problem. He gets over this divorce and is ready to build a new life for himself. But Bellow gives us a lot of pages of the harshness and the suffering and the dark side of life before we ever get into this hope-filled aspect of human existence.
I was just noticing that we've really been discussing two Jewish authors, and that the significant contribution of Jewish American writers in the 20th century really can't be overestimated. Woody Allen represents the questioner, the one who is still tortured. Saul Bellow represents one who is given a certain affirmation. We also have Bernard Malamud, who would also give a hopeful and optimistic view to the question of human suffering and the question of whether or not life is absurd. He, for instance, will say with regard to the whole problem of human suffering, which he sees somehow the Jewish figure as a paradigm of, that I'm against suffering when it occurs, but when it does happen, why waste the experience? And
this
he sees
Bernard Malamud.
This is Bernard Malamud,
Mm-hmm.
right, another Jewish writer, who sees suffering as a path to compassion, and who again sees that while life very often seems to sort of gang up on us, that we can become victims of circumstances very often, that we can still outrun our fate, that we can still somehow transcend our problems. He says that he's interested primarily in man's hidden strength. He's interested in the resources of the spirit, the strength people often don't know they have until they're confronted with a crisis. I find it interesting that these men of Jewish background who have known in one way or another the horror of the Holocaust and feel it in a way that I think we probably cannot, still can gear their literature in such a way that we sense in them hope and a certain essential optimism about life being meaningful.
That's a powerful statement you make, and well said. And I often think that in the face of the Holocaust, which seems to me to be the great absurdity of human history because of its sort of rational and calculated terror and the terrible, monstrous quality of the evil, that it represents the most difficult kind of problem to deal with. I remember hearing Elie Wiesel one time, another Jewish writer, saying that human suffering teaches us only one thing, that is, not to inflict suffering on somebody else. Now, Wiesel was in the camps as a young person himself, and, it's hard. There were some people who couldn't move beyond that. I mean, just to say, it was too absurd, too terrible, but yet I think what you said, it really represents a triumph of the human spirit to be able somehow to come back and see some sort of meaning. And I guess, right within the Jewish tradition, we have that suffering servant idea, the person who would take on himself the suffering of the whole group. And there really is a terrible poignancy about it. And those of us who stand outside that Jewish world, in a sense, have to maintain ultimate kind of respect for that. I felt that a little bit at the prayer service the other day for when the Jewish people were praying together and remembering the Holocaust, that that's their event in a way. One stands there as an outsider in a way, only by way of giving some sort of support and trying to understand. I think out of our Christian tradition, then we really have that figure of the cross there at the center, that's talking to us about the redemptive quality of human suffering. And it represents really our final answer, the death and resurrection of Jesus, to the whole question of absurdity that we experience today. I don't know, did you want to comment further at all? I think that we can perhaps stay with this Christian side of it for a while, if you want to do that, and to see how that is supposed to operate for us. I know in my own life, when I think as a tourist, I remember many years ago going through Dachau and just seeing that the terrible remembrance there of the Holocaust. It was one of the great formative influences in my life, something that still sticks in my imagination and memory, and it's one of the harder things for me to deal with. And yet, what I find instinctively happening again, without any kind of thought process or anything, is my affirmation that yet, even despite that, it still all makes sense. Somehow the good will win out over the evil. Still, somehow it makes sense to hang in there and continue the struggle even in the face of this monstrous kind of evil. And that really, I think, can be seen only as a gift. My response to that is, only words I can think of are thank you for that kind of gift.
I think Saul Bellow's description of us as not gods nor beasts, but savages of a somewhat damaged but not extinguished nobility probably sums that up. The capacity for something like the Holocaust, but also the ability to transcend.
Oh, that's, what was the last phrase? An inextinguishable nobility?
But not extinguished.
Nobility.
Nobility.
Yes, that the human being has a powerful statement, and probably even more powerful, as you have really well pointed out, coming from the Jewish authors. I think that what we need to do in the face of this monstrous evil is to try to tap the roots of our faith, to be thankful for any of the times when we deal well with anxiety, when we can overcome it, and when we feel a strength in the midst of all of that absurdity. And I think when we get down to the point of saying, well, how do we account for this, we turn ourselves in our Christian tradition to the story of Jesus, and we say, here was one who took on all the darkness of life and yet triumphed over it, who was put to death in an unfair manner, and yet goodness was brought out of that he becomes the glorified Lord for us, and that he shares that life with us. That's the great message of hope that we carry and hopefully share with others.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Sister Pat Schnapp, an associate pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. The topic of this week's Reflections was the quest for meaning in the face of monstrous evil. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner.